Okay, tonight's talk is entitled Embudo, an Archaeology of the First 300 Years. It reflects the fact that this year is the 300th anniversary of the establishment of the San Antonio del Embudo land grant in 1725. Since 2011, there's been an ongoing project to investigate the archaeological record of the settlement and the wider area by both professors and their college student field crews. This summer, in addition to members from the United States, there are students from China, India, Ecuador, Jamaica, and Iran. In past years, we've had participants associated with Ireland, England, Brazil, among other countries. In other words, a diverse group of people from all over the world who were here on a student visa or whose families have recently immigrated or a long time ago immigrated, have contributed enormously to the cultural life of Dixon in helping us understand the archaeological details of the human habitation of this area. And we appreciate all of them and all of you here this summer. Thank you. The prime mover and shaker behind this entire enterprise has been Barnard Professor and Dixon's resident archaeologist, Sev Fowles. I've said this before about him. Yeah. I've said this before about him, but some of you weren't there, so it bears repeating. Sev has done more than any other person now living or who has ever lived to unearth, literally, the deep history of the ground we are sitting on right now. So I'll turn the mic over to him. Let's welcome Sev.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. That was very sweet. And I was realizing as you were doing that kind introduction that there's one other nation represented in our field school, this field program this summer. Braylon Quiver over there from the nation of Piccaries. So of course the story that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight is a story situated on Piccaries land, so it's been a special honor to have you take part. Yet again, this is like your fourth summer doing archaeology with us, so please give Braylon a really warm welcome when you I have a lot of other thank yous to make that I'll try and be brief about, but I first want to acknowledge Levi Romero, who couldn't be with us tonight, but is a co-director on this project. His students from the University of New Mexico have been regular presences on the research that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. But there are a whole bunch of other folks from the community that I'm just so grateful to for their contributions. First and foremost, Esteban Arellano, the late Esteban Arellano, who served as our sort of liaison with the community when we first started this project back in 2011, mentored so many of my students and myself. When he passed away, David Valdez really took up that mantle and was a really important mentor to me. We missed him as well. Ganito Sanchez, my neighbor out there on the plaza, taught me a lot. I'm not sure all of it was true, but he taught me a lot. I'm very grateful to be his neighbor for a number of years. Ivan Archuleta, who hung out on front of the co-op and had so many conversations with the students that I've brought out here. I think about Ivan regularly as well. And then Nacho Montoya, who's also not with us, but grew up on the plaza and had shared a great deal with all of us. So there are many here tonight. Tommy, I see you in the back, who helped us understand the history of this place. Anyway, thank you to all of you and to everyone who's been such a great host for us here. I want to tonight do a real quick, bird's eye view of what's now, 15 years worth of research into the archaeology of this area. There's a lot to cover. I have a lot of slides. I'll be moving through relatively quickly. But, I'm going to put a special spotlight on the excavations from this summer. which we're just finishing up. These are, from maybe 3 weeks ago out there when we were digging away. The pit's much larger now. I want to, just before I dive into the talk proper, send a special invitation to all of you to come join us tomorrow. If you'd like to come and see some of the excavation units that I'll be sharing with you tonight, you can come and do that. So tomorrow morning, I think we'll probably be working through about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Stop by on the old plaza and come check out what we're doing. We welcome your visit. I also want to acknowledge that the research that we're doing out there on the plaza, that specific component of the work began in 2015 at the request of David Valdez, who had really taken an important position in trying to bring back the old firehouse, before that the old dance hall, before that the old Sala Filantropica, as it's known here locally. That's the structure that you're seeing here. In 2015, we were asked by the community to conduct some excavations out in front of the Sala in hopes of registering it with the National Registry of Historic Places. We still haven't gotten to the point of submitting that paperwork yet. It's up to the community to really assert their desire to do that again. But we're continuing on that project that David Valdez had asked us to take on, and I think finding a great deal more in the process. I, have been very interested this summer in the research. It's taking my thought in a different kind of direction, in part working in the shadow of the Sala, one of these philanthropic societies, a mutual aid society from around the turn of the last century, the kind of structures that were being built in communities all throughout Texas and New Mexico, partly by Mexican immigrants who were coming in, partly by those who were being disenfranchised by what was then, the second, third generation of American imperialism in this area and the onset of a monetary economy. I'm interested in what mutual aid looked like in a building like this, in a community like this. But I also have gotten very interested as we continue to pull out sherd after sherd after sherd from the ground underneath what you all walk on every day. Sherds that almost entirely come from indigenous communities, traded into Dixon over the last 300 years. This was a community that if you went back 200 years in time, would have looked very much like a pueblo. Indeed, everything they cooked in and ate off of was entirely Puebloan by construction. So here you're looking at a black on red shirt from the Taylor Basin that came out of the excavations. It's one of tens of thousands that we've excavated. And over again, there's this story of interrelations, inter-economic relations between the Hispanos who lived here and the neighboring Pueblo communities. I'm interested in how sherds like this, or sherds like this, ended up in a place like Dixon, like Embudo. What were the nature of the relations between the local vecinos and their indigenous neighbors? I think that there's a story there that we haven't appreciated. I'm going to return to that at the very end of my comments tonight, which will mostly be showing you a bunch of great objects from our excavations. But I want to plant that seed in your mind. How did this pottery end up in the homes up here? Did they go down and knock on the door of folks down at Okiawinge or Santa Clara and say, hey, do you have any pots for sale? I'd like to buy them. Probably not. Was it a form of barter? This is how most archaeologists, if they comment on it at all, refer to it. Oh, I've got some corn. You've got a pot. Let's trade. I think that's a really misleading way of representing the economic systems that were in place here up until very recently. So again, I'll return to this theme at the very end, but I want to plant that seed. How did all this indigenous pottery show up in this community? And in doing so, I'm going to sort of end with a couple of comments about what my really important colleague, Sunday Eiselt, and her partner, Andrew Darling, referred to as vecino economics. I'm just putting a little shout out to Sunday, in part because she was one of the only archaeologists to raise these questions. What was the nature of economic systems out here before capitalism just sort of besieged this area at the start of the 20th century with the establishment of the railroad? So I'm going to be trying to offer a few thoughts about vecino economics at the end of the talk. But before we get there, let's look at some remarkable finds from your own community, from right below your feet, things that you've walked over for decades perhaps and not realized. I'm going to After these introductory comments, I'm going to briefly review what we know about the history of Embudo, the land grant, now 300 years old, what we know about it from the textual record, from the archives as traditionally understood. Then I'll spend most of my time talking about the testimony of archaeology, which is its own archive that has extraordinary things to teach us about the past of this community. And then I'm going to raise just a few questions that I think are important about Vecino-economics, this long history of interactions between the communities out here. Okay, so the textual record. Let's think with the Spanish archives. And here I wanted to begin with a recognition of Malcolm E. Wright's seminal book, Land Grants and Lawsuits in Northern New Mexico. We recently lost Malcolm E. Wright. That's another big hit to the community here. I know he has many family in the region, but also to the community of historians who've learned a great deal from him. E. Wright brought together those land grant histories, and I'm just going to share some of the results here. All of this is well documented in the Spanish archives. We can look to our local community. Embudo is situated in the center of the universe, as well it should be, with a number of other communities, some settlers, some indigenous surrounding it. If you consult the archives of the Spanish land grants, one name in particular, in this region at least, looms quite large, and that's the Martin families. They're a family that goes right back to the early days of the Spanish colony here. I've offered you a brief genealogy of the Martin or Martin Serrano family, which you can see begins with Oñate's original entry into this area in 1598. Hernan Martin Serrano was an important sergeant in Oñate's army. He then gave birth to Luis Martin Serrano, who was one of the key figures in the early settlement of Santa Cruz, just to the south of us, who then was followed by Pedro Martin Serrano, who then was followed by Sebastian Martin, who was born here in New Mexico, left during the Pueblo Revolt, and then, following the Pueblo Revolt, established one of the really important land grants, the Sebastian Martin grant just to the south of us, established in 1703, shortly after the Pueblo Revolt. Now that's important to Embudo's story, in part because the land grant that we're residing on today was established by Sebastian Martin's brother, Francisco Martin, who was being squeezed out of land down just north of Okeowinge, and was looking for another place to settle. The Sebastian Martin grant actually extended pretty much up to the river up here, at least in the early documents, it seems to suggest that. But Francisco Martin was able to, with a few colleagues, to convince the Royal Crown that another grant should be established, and that's the grant that we now know as San Antonio del Embudo. So, in effect, Embudo is, an extension of the Sebastian Martin grant, at least in terms of kinship, in terms of the Martin family. And here I wanted to draw briefly from Esteban's wonderful book, Enduring Acequias, which I know many of you have read. I'm pulling out one little remarkable detail. The Martin Serranos, of which Francisco Martin, one of the founding figures of this community, the Martin Serranos, writes Esteban, considered themselves to be not Spanish, but Indios. He writes that it is said that once two Martin Serrano first cousins wanted to marry and the church wouldn't allow them, they responded, "We are Indians and don't have to follow church law," and they got married. There's probably a lot of truth to that. The folks who came up as Spanish settlers were as often as not from indigenous Mexican communities. And so there was, right from the beginning of the settlement up here, a great deal of indigenous settler mixtures. And it seems like our community was founded on that mixture, again, right from the beginning. Now, they expanded up from the south, from the Sebastian Martin land grant. And we can see in the archives a continuing set of relationships between this community and the Tewa Pueblos to the south. In fact, most of the pottery, those sherds that I already showed you, many of the ones that I'll be sharing with you in just a moment, they all come from Tewa communities, the exception being really the hickory, Apache, micaceous pottery, which was fairly substantial here as well. But Embudo, the early residents of Embudo looked south for their economic relations with other Pueblo groups. They didn't look towards Pickeries terribly much. At least in Pickeries, material culture isn't well represented in the archaeology here. Why might that have been? Where's Braylon? I'm looking at Braylon. Because they stole Pickeries land, right? Because Embudo was founded on Pickeries farmland. They had been using it more recently for grazing horses. Pickeries protested the Embudo land grant right from the beginning. They showed up there to say, no, this is our land, you can't take this. And actually, if you look throughout the 18th century, Pickeries continuously appears in the Spanish archives protesting the encroachment of Spanish flocks who were let to pasture in Pickeries cornfields. So that was a real big problem with the community. While now we think about a growing set of relations between Dixon and Pickeries, which is wonderful, there was a fraught relationship there that goes way back to the founding of the land grant. In fact, it extended right up until the end of the 1800s. I'll share with you in just a moment the court cases when the Embudo land grant wasn't recognized by the US government. Tremendous details in there about local relations. And one of them that I found really fascinating is that in that little gap between the Embudo land grant and the Pickeries land grant, there were all these piles of rocks that had been erected by members of the Pickeries nation. Those were piles of rocks telling the Embudo residents they're not allowed to go past those rocks. It was highly policed, as it were. That from 1898 was still in place, that kind of barrier to interaction. So the folks from Embudo looked south, to the Sebastian Martin land grant, to the Tewa Pueblos, and the Martins expanded in other directions as well. Ojo Caliente was established in 1736 by Antonio Martin, another member of that clan. And as we look towards the other land grants in this area that date to the 18th century, we can note other communities like Abiquiu, which was established in 1742 by a community of Tewa refugees who had been out at Hopi. They were relocated back in Abiquiu. We talk about Abiquiu as a Genízaro settlement today, folks with native ancestry but living as Spaniards. So we could include Ojo Caliente in that. I think we can include Embudo in that characterization as well. And then one of the more interesting cases, the Las Trampas land grant, established in 1751. This was actually established by indigenous Mexicans who had been living in Santa Fe, who then were relocated. They had family ties to the Martins, and Sebastian Martin gave up part of his grant to let them establish the Trampas grant. So effectively, in the 18th century, when Embudo was founded, it was one of a number of land grants that had been set up as part of what we refer to as this kind of Genízaro buffer zone. They were there to take the hit from Comanche raiding, Ute raiding, Apache raiding. They were militarily strategic. In fact, Embudo was only occupied for a generation before the locals said, this is crazy. There were 6 families living up here in 1747. And they said, there's no way we can survive up here. We're in much too precarious a position. They retreated back to Santa Cruz. In 1750, the governor forced them to come back. Why? Because it was militarily necessary for the elites down in Santa Fe. So Embudo has always been on a kind of frontier within New Mexico, which itself was a frontier in the Spanish Empire. Okay, so we can look to land grant documents to understand a great deal of the dynamics that lie behind Embudo's founding. It was set up by folks of mixed heritage to take the hit on all of these dangers in the north, at least as they were perceived by folks down in Santa Fe. There's a more intimate, history that can be written by looking at other sorts of archival documents. And here I'm pointing especially to the wills that were written in the 18th century by some of the residents here. You're looking at Francisco Martin's will on the right-hand side. That's the entirety of it. It dates to 1764, and it outlines all of his possessions. This is a gold mine for archaeologists. I should say, rather, that it doesn't outline all of his possessions. There was a great deal of the material culture of these worlds that doesn't get represented in a will like this. things like pottery that were used by women in the household and traded from neighboring pueblos. But anyway, this is a really important document. We have Juan Francisco Martin's son's will as well, from 1767. He died 3 years after his father. And documents like this are crucial to the interpretation of the archaeological record and to our understanding of the early days in Embudo more generally. We learn, for example, that Juan Francisco Martin, and here you're looking at an extract, a translated extract from Juan Francisco Martin's will from 1767. It's there that we find out that although he lived in Embudo, although his primary residence was here, he declares that he also has a ranch in the Valley of Taos, which he acquired by royal sale, as shown by the deed which is in my possession. He also declares that he owns another ranch in Santa Barbara, which with a 10-room house that he built, 5 below, 5 above, a 2-story adobe structure, which would have been relatively rare for that time period. He acquired that as a royal grant. So there was yet another grant that was given to the Martin family up in Santa Barbara. And then he's declaring that he has a ranch in San Antonio del Embudo that he inherited from his father, Francisco Martin. This too is important for us to remember as we think about that question of vecino economics. These weren't provincial folks. They were folks who had networks, trade networks throughout the Puebloan world, but they also had residences in other parts of Rio Arriba. So here, again, you're looking at Embudo, where Juan Francisco Martin had inherited his primary property. He had land over in Santa Barbara, a 10-room home there by a royal grant, and then another property by royal sale up near Ranches de Taos, which makes it all the more remarkable that most of the indigenous relations that he had were to the south, to the Tewa folks, just near this Sebastian Martin grant. Okay, so there are other documents that we could spend a lot of time talking about, and I'm going to weave them into my commentary tonight. One of the most remarkable is from 1898. It's the culmination of a series of court cases from 1893 to 1898. I feel like I should share them with anybody who lives here. This was the Antonio Griego et al. Versus the United States case. This was the case in which the Embudo land grant was not recognized by the US government, despite the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo saying that it should be recognized. And what you can read in this like 40-page document, all typed up from the late 19th century and available at the University of New Mexico archives, is a series of, I'm trying to find a delicate word here. The Anglo lawyers were real dicks, let's just put it that way, and you can see that in the transcription. And you can see them just pestering local folks from this community, saying, oh, come on, your community's old, how do you know that? Come on, trying to delegitimize the grant. It's fascinating reading, it's a study in American imperialism. We should all read this document. Anyway, here's the beginning of it. I'll be weaving some of the elements of it into my interpretation of the archaeological record. Suffice it to say, these were folks who were like 70 years old in 1898, commenting on the history of this community. So it's a key archive for those of us studying, especially the 19th century. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one other important document for those of us conducting archaeology up here. This was during the Great Depression. Marta Viegel's 1935 Tewa Basin study. She went out to all the little communities out here and wrote up reports on the economic conditions of life in these areas. This is a real difficult time period. Cash economy had just kind of started up. At the start of the 20th century, money was starting to circulate. Then comes the Great Depression, and basically all those jobs that weren't, subsistence oriented were undercut. Folks went back to living in a fully subsistence economy sort of way, and we're in real dire economic straits. Anyway, she documents all of this, and this is an extract from the Embudo and Dixon chapter, and you're not meant to read this. It's a wealth of information on the 1,000 or so individuals who lived within the greater Dixon area, not just in the immediate plaza zone. She wasn't terribly kind to our community, so right in the start of the second paragraph, she notes Dixon is like none other of the community studied. In a way, it might be considered a problem community. It makes me proud, I think, you know, sort of like, okay, sure, we'll be proud of children, but, you know, and then she goes on to say that drinking is practically the only indoor sport, as it is certainly the most popular. So it's not a particularly, you know, generous read on the community. She does point out that it's, ironically, also an especially religious community. And she says that, you know, this doesn't do justice to the 50% of the really sober-minded, hardworking folks here. But clearly she wasn't impressed. Okay, so this is why archaeology is important. This is why an archaeology of the 1930s is important, because we need to fight against those kinds of portrayals, which were really by anglers who are coming in and oftentimes not really seeing the whole picture. They talk to a few folks, they get an impression, and you know, they go and write a book about it or whatever. So let's look at the testimony of archaeology, which is extraordinary. You're embarrassed over here. I was hoping to embarrass you. Yeah. There's a post hole there. She's very excited. So archaeology fills in a lot of the gaps, you know. And for me, archaeology is many things. On one hand, it's a kind of mode of enchantment. There's no way that you can walk around this community after you've dug down in the ground, knowing what's down there. You walk gently on the earth if you're an archaeologist. For me, it enchants the land. There's a politics to that that's important. So, you know, that's part of what archaeology is for me, but it's also this critical enterprise where we take the archival documents written by the elites, and indeed Francisco Martin was a kind of elite in Dixon. It's all relative, of course. He was the wealthiest of the poor here. But, you know, archaeology provides, you know, the everyman's history. And so we can look at a variety of our own archives as archaeologists. For example, rock art, which I won't go on and on about. Many of you know that I really am committed to rock art studies. I think it has a lot to tell us. I showed this image in a talk I gave here last summer. I'm still like overwhelmed by how cool it is, so I couldn't help but share it with you again. This is one of the earliest Hispano rock art panels that I know of, at least I think it is. This is our drawing of it. We can take away some of the secondary additions to it, and you're looking at a profile of an individual here who sure looks a whole lot like, you know, one of those folks right from the beginning of the colonial project out here. I mean, what you're looking at is a figure who has this ruff, which is a sign of privilege. The elite wore it in Spain and in Mexico, you know, during the mid-16th and through the mid-17th centuries. It's not the kind of thing that's very common to find at all, certainly not in rock art. I do think this comes from the early colonial explorations up here. It might be commemorating one of the leaders of one of those expeditions. When might this have been pecked? Well, I can't give you the day, or the year rather, but we can think about what time of year it might have been. Because this is a religious panel, it's not only depicting an early Spanish explorer in this region. Sorry, this is a panel, I should explain, from up near Pilar. So it's just up the road from us, right? And I share it with you because it's part of Greater Embudo. Okay, so, you know, let's say 1600 or so. That's a reasonable estimate as to when this might have been created. It's also a religious rock art panel. There's a communion chalice right next to this individual. And really significantly, what you're looking at are crosses, but they're crosses that have been covered, which is, you know, what you do during Lent. So this might be commemorating those Lenten services that were being recognized even while you were out on an expedition. Okay, so this isn't you know, a bottom-up history yet. I still think that was the elite portrayal of the history of this region that we're seeing there, perhaps by someone who is kind of claiming the land. I want to take you down from Pilar down to where my students are staying this summer at Embudo Station. Thank you, Embudo Station and Dolph, for letting my students stay down near the old restaurant. Anyway, we've taken that as an opportunity to do some survey around those sandstone cliffs that you see behind the restaurant and the basalt in front of it. And this has proven very interesting. We found a lot of rock art out there. But as I've been thinking through how to interpret what we found, my thoughts wandered back to that Sebastian Martin land grant, you know, which was established you know, before Dixon, and which had a boundary that extended up effectively to the Embudo River. This is from a translation of the actual land grant document itself. On the north, the boundary is described as being a cross, which was erected on the canyon which ran to El Embudo. It's kind of a vague statement, but somewhere in this area is a reasonable way of interpreting it. Certainly the special land grant had a northern boundary right up about where Embudo Station is, which I think might help us explain one of the rock art panels that we found out behind the old restaurant on a promontory, quite a prominent spot. And what you're looking at is one of the most elaborate cross rock art panels that I've seen. Certainly as an individual cross, it's outlined and has subsidiary crosses coming off of it. It's not the kind of thing that we've documented elsewhere in the region, produced by Hermanos and the Penitente Brotherhood, for example. Those are typically much more simple. This is ornate in many ways. It's reasonable to think that that erected cross might have fallen down, and this ornate cross very well might be a landmarker. This might be the very edge of the Sebastian Martin grant being depicted in rock art out there just above Embudo Station. Okay, so again, that's still a kind of top-down or elite portrayal of, of history as seen through archaeology. Let's think bottom-up now. This is another rock art panel that's right there behind Embudo Station. Where's Sophia? Over in the corner. You found this one, didn't you? Okay, so I'll always be grateful to you for that. This is a remarkable panel. It conforms to the Hickory Apache style of rock art production. And I think what we're looking at here is a specific representation of early Spaniards by indigenous people who are commenting on those settlers who during the 1700s were actively displacing not just Hickories over here, but the Apache, who were really noted in the archives as being the primary occupants of the Embudo Station area. They were farming down there. So what do you see here? Well, if we zoom in, you see two horsemen. You can see they're kind of funky looking horses, right? There are the ears, here's the, here's the mouth of it, here's the body. They've got split tails, which is a distinctive element here. But then they've got these riders who are on top of them. And the most distinctive feature there is the hand on the hip that you'll see on both of them. This was a very specific way in which indigenous folks referenced whiteness or settler identities. Why? Because settlers stood around like this all the time watching native folks work, and they thought, that's a weird thing to do. Why the heck do you have your hands on your head? We don't do that. So it's a bodily gesture that was characteristic of settlers. In fact, if you look at indigenous Australian rock art from the same time period, how did they depict white folks? Like that. And so there's always a kind of an arm akimbo or a hat line. Those are the other two that's the other signifier here. So what are they doing? It's hard for me not to see this as a kind of trap. They're being trapped. There was even a kind of indigenous Athabascan reference for the power, the destructive power of lightning, the violent power of lightning. That's this barbed zigzag right there. I do think that this is the kind of aggressive act against settlers who are actively displaying Hickory Apache folks in what would become the Embudo land grants. A kind of bottom-up history, a kind of resistance panel. I have a hard time not talking about the Comanche in any talk, so I'm going to just keep it to one panel, but this is one of my favorites from our work up in Vista Verde. And I use this merely to underscore the point that there are these bottom-up histories, indigenous histories we can see through the rock art. What you're looking at here is not an Athabascan confrontation with the Spanish, but a Comanche confrontation. These are scratched glyphs. You're looking at a bunch of pedestrian shield-bearing warriors. And what are they doing? Well, let's see if I can point to it here. Right down here, you see a shield bearer who's reaching out to Count Coup on this person. Okay, and there's the blow-up detail. What do you notice of that individual? Right, settler. Those are the two this was in plain sign language, the sign for white guy, the hand, the fingers across the forehead. And this has yet to be fully appreciated, but that's, we're confident, another settler reference. So they're attacking one of the earlier settlers in this 18th century image. Rock art has a lot of potential to inform on the history here. There's so much more that we could discuss there, but I want to move towards the archaeology of the plaza itself. We can look at things like architecture. This is an image that you'll see, I think it's in the co-op, it used to be at least. This is from around 1900. I think this is the earliest image, certainly that I've ever seen, that Levi's ever seen, of Dixon. There are no pitched roofs with the exception of the Presbyterian church over here. It looks like a very different world than we live in today. But as archaeologists, we can look to the architecture of this community and try to learn a little bit about its history, our history. I'm drawing your attention first, however, to one architectural element that we can't study. This is the old church, which if you're trying to orient yourself in this photograph, good luck. This is the earlier church, before the 1920s church, the Catholic church that graces our plaza area today. This was facing south rather than facing west, but it was still in the same general area that the Catholic Church is based today. How do we know it was built in 1833? You'd have to go to that horrible document from 1898 when the lawyers for the United States government were grilling local folks trying to delegitimize their land grant. And if you go to that document, you'll find things like this. The lawyer asks, is there any church at that place? The answer, forgetting who this was, I apologize, says, yes, sir. What are the indications of the age of the church? Again, this was in 1898, before our contemporary church. The church was finished in 1833. Do you know when they commenced to build it? I do not know, but I knew when it was finished because the date is written when it was finished on the church, on the wall, finished in 1833. So, as far as I know, it's actually never been written down in any of the histories of Dixon, but, our first church that was here, Catholic Church, was built in 1833, finished in 1833. We are unable to study that today, of course. It's under more contemporary construction, but we can think about that in relation to what we all imagine as the old plaza. Certainly in the 19th century, this would have been the old plaza, with Sage's property, maybe there's Sage Vogel on the east, with Eli Montoya's property and the old Sala on the west. And we can see that the Catholic Church was built nearby that old plaza, but there was no room to build it inside. So this had an unusual plan for many of the older communities in this area. The church is sort of marginal in a way. There are other architectural elements that are in this early photograph that we have been able to study, however, archaeologically. And here I'm pointing in particular to the 18th century torreones that were both still standing up until the 1960s, which breaks my heart. One of them we still can see the traces of, the other has been fully effaced. Nevertheless, these 18th century torreones have been the object of our investigations. And one of the things that it's really caused me to reflect on is the fact that the plaza, the old plaza as we think about it, probably was structured very differently. Those two torreones would have been on the corners, which would have meant that only the eastern half of the old plaza, what we think of as the old plaza, was probably part of that defensive compound that they were protecting. So a much more modest 18th century plaza. Again, think of about 8 families living out there, and only 8 families. If we zoom in, this is a grainy close-up of, you can see the one torreon on the northeastern portion of the old plaza is still standing there, the other is partially hidden. But how do we know, when these were built? Well, I can give you an entirely longer discussion of this. I'm pretty confident it was between Francisco Martin's will in 1764 and Juan Francisco Martin's will in 1767, because one of them refers to the torreons and the other didn't. So sometime in the 1760s, these torreons were built. But these became the object of reflection in those court cases from 1898. This is the testimony of Albino Lopez, who was born around 1840. He was a farmer here, he was the postmaster. And the lawyers are saying, what are the indications of the town of Embudo as to its age? Again, they're trying to say, isn't it just a little young place that hasn't been around for very long? The answer that Mr. Lopez gives, he says, it's very old. What is there to indicate that it's an old place? They've got the land grant documents from the 18th century there as part of the testimony. It's amazing they keep pushing these folks. What's Mr. Lopez's answer? He says, the indications of it being old are some round towers that I suppose were built there at a very great date. when the Indians were hostile and used to happen in New Mexico, and also for the narrow streets of the place that were made in order to be protected from the Indians. I'm fascinated by this document, so I've included a little bit more. The lawyer asked, describe a little more particularly in respect to these round towers, torreones. Mr. Lopez responds, I can state that in the old times, that is from the appearance of the place, and from what the old men used to say, it was customary to make these round towers at the corners of the settlement in order to get into these towers and fight the Indians, or repel an invasion. And they used to build also two-story houses after the fashion of the Indians. And the indications of these towers, that they are round towers, is that they are very old. Okay, folks always knew these dated back to the 18th century, to the early times of the settlement here. And there's no question about that. There's a kind of mythology in the community, however, of these as embattled spaces where they fought either the Piccaries, I've heard those stories from some local residents whose families go way back, or the Comanche. That's the other story I've heard from local community members. I'm not saying that that wasn't true, but these structures have very different histories to reveal if we actually dive into them. So this is the Northeast Torreon in 1939. Levi actually, this is, and Tommy, this is one of, where's Tommy? I think this is one of your relatives. At least Levi knew who it was, I think. So a couple generations back, standing proudly out in front of the old Torreon, which I think must have been owned by your family back then. That's what it looked like in 1939. Here's what it looked like in 1960. The roof is gone, it's collapsing. And here's what it looked like in 2017, shortly after Sage Vogel bought this property, and shortly after I had gone to Sage and other members of the Plaza Association to say, hey, would you all be interested before it collapses any further in gathering some data about the history of this structure? So you can see we've laid out our first archaeological unit and we're about to excavate. So just to give you an overview quickly, all of those little red squares that you see there are excavation units, excluding the ones that we put in this summer. We've dug little square pits all over the plaza, as you can see. So we're looking in the upper left-hand corner, that round structure, that's the Torreon. Those are the units that we dug. And this is what it looked like when you open it up. This is actually has a little bit of subfloor testing in the middle, but yes, it's a Torreon. It's got big, thick walls. You could have defended yourself pretty happily in there. But was it used as a defensive structure most of its history? Not at all. This was an agricultural facility for most of its life. It's been, probably for the last 2 centuries of its life. What the floor was dominated by were 2 very large root cellars, this deep. These are the kinds of things that we actually found the impressions next to. They would hang objects in that cool underground space. And so this was where a lot of food storage was happening. There are agricultural implements that we found all over the floor. Perhaps even more interesting than the architecture itself, which again, despite all the mythologies of this being a kind of perpetual defensive structure, is mostly agricultural. Beyond the architecture, it's really the artifacts that came from this structure that have really impressed us. So here you're looking at a sample of early 20th century objects that were left there when this started to go into ruin. You see some spike nails from the railroad, that's from 1909. An axe head. My favorite object of the metals that we recovered are these sardine can keys, which everybody's familiar with those, right? You twist out the sardine can. There is a local story that these were used as hair curlers by women. They heat them up and you do your hair with the sardine can keys. It's great to think about these as part of the way resourceful women in the early 20th century and throughout the Depression, kept themselves beautiful. There were other remarkable objects. We actually, had a U.S. military button from sometime between 1854 and 1875, documenting perhaps some of the early military service that members of the Embudo community, what would become a long tradition of service in the U.S. military. That came out of those excavations, as well as some pennies that show when the real dumping events in this structure took place. It was in the 40s, really, when we find most of the material being dumped in the fill of these now crumbling structures. right after that picture, Tommy, of your ancestor was taken. Most of what we found in this structure were bottles, hundreds of bottles. I'm not going to say a lot about them, except those two on the right are extraordinary in my mind, because what you really clearly see is all these Anglos who were at vineyards in California were marketing Catholicism, were using Catholicism to market liquor to local folks. So, the bishop on the wine bottle, this was the Padre Vineyards Company on the right. Same time that the Protestants were in here critiquing everyone for their Catholicism, they were selling everything using Catholicism. On the left-hand side, another Catholic object, as it were, one of these plaster casts of, or plaster statues of Mary. This one, I don't know what the story is here, but it's headless, and it was thrown from the Catholic Church into the Torium. Perhaps by, well, I wouldn't say it, never mind. Those of you who know the Dixon case probably know what I was angling at there. Other things as well that mark the beginnings of the post-war commodification of the community. So we found some of the first electrical objects. Dixon's Plaza wasn't electrified until the 1950s, really. Most homes weren't electrified until the 1950s. This created all new sorts of demands for, you had electricity bills, you had monthly bills for the first time, you needed coin. This forced people into a wage labor economy. So some of the artifacts of that transformation also came from those excavations. These, I have to, along with the sardine can curlers, this is my second favorite object, or it's right up there with the sardine can curlers. And this is also not just an indication of why archaeology, the material culture of archaeology is important, but also why oral history is a key method for archaeologists. You all know what those are, yeah? Linoleum tile, right? So, the linoleum that was put on, and there'd be layers of linoleum. People talk about the feeling of the 7 layers of linoleum, it felt like. This is linoleum, that we found in the Torium. What's linoleum doing in there? The Torium never had linoleum floors. Well, this is why it was really beneficial to know people in town, smart people who think very deeply about their own heritage. In this case, I'm referring to Levi Romero and his own studies of Chicano activism during the 70s in this community. The Torium that we were excavating here from a 1960 aerial image is right across from La Academia, the major center of activism for those who are trying to push back against the continued erosion of Hispano rights to land, to life. La Academia was a place of, in many ways anti-Anglo sentiments, but it's more precise to say that it was a center of anti-modern or anti-US culture. This was a place where, as Levi described it in one of these wonderful stories that he would tell out on the site, where they were ripping out the cardboard ceilings, where they were ripping up the linoleum and throwing it away so they could return to the vigas, to the dirt walls, to that which they regarded as traditional to their community. They dumped their linoleum in the Torium. For me, it's an important archaeological artifact of 1970s Chicano activism that comes out of the ground. Something we would have never thought about had we not been in dialogue with the archaeologists. There are other examples of how oral history has really aided in our interpretation of the archaeological remains, both the architecture and the artifacts. We can look to the Northwest Torium that was down here in 1960, still roofed. It was Tony Vahil who actually took this down to help build another structure on his property. But we were excavating out on that Torium back in 2011. This was the first structure that we wanted to understand because it was under a parking lot. It was getting disturbed. We wanted to see what we could recover from it. And who would walk up to our excavations but Marjorie Duran. This is members of the Duran family who ended up coming and visiting us quite a bit that summer. The elderly, the matriarch of the family who's seated in the center there, I can't remember her name, I apologize to her for forgetting her name. She had hung out in all of these rooms on the plaza, back in the day, and had tremendous stories to tell us about playing marbles, about where the pigs were kept, an extraordinary wealth of information That's incidentally one of those old copper plate images, probably one of the Duran family members that had been in my home. This is outside of my home. And we were able to give it back to the family, which was a lovely thing to do. Anyway, she clarified that that torreon on the northwest corner wasn't a big military structure either, at least throughout most of its history. You know, in the early 20th century, it was a pig pen. That's where all the pigs were kept. It was a torreon for pigs, as they were defensively kept in there, away from the, you know, bobcats or whatever else might attack it. So, you know, so it was very useful to be able to speak with her. That structure really didn't exist. We only had post holes when we excavated it. We learned a lot from them about the architecture that was right alongside the torreon. Here I'm getting personal. This is the home that I now live in, that I'm honored to maintain, you know, for another 300 years, hopefully. This was originally one of Juan Francisco Martin's part of his property. It then entered into the Suazo family, and then ultimately into the Duran family, although they were all intermarried. And it was a continuous line of succession right up until the mid-20th century. So, you know, this is from 1960. You can see the flat roofs there, the dirt roofs. If you're an archaeologist and you buy a home like this, and you do renovations, it's an extraordinary opportunity to do archaeology without the worry of having to tarp your units. You know, you can, at spring break, convince your wife to come out and dig with you inside. You know, the only problem is that the power is out because they were doing work on the house. Anyway, back in 2022, 21, 22, we were doing renovations. There are significant renovations, which was so great. We found out so much about the history of the plaza through those renovations. So you pull up the bricks, you pull up the particle board, you find the old boards, the old hand-cut timbers that are down below all of that, you know, and you find behind the walls things like, you know, this Depression-era dried prunes for relief, not to be sold. You know, this is probably from the 30s, that was stuck behind one of the housing members. I'm sure some of you have these things behind the walls in your homes too. But if you're systematic about it, as we tried to be, this is Elle Morris, an Egyptologist, my partner, you know, who I convinced to come out over spring break, and we did some excavations in 2022. You know, you find, again, part of the history of the community that you've been walking over for, you know, for, in our case, 7 years. No, more than that, gosh, 22 years, what would it have been, 12 years by that point. You find as soon as you dig beneath the floor, as I'm sure you would find if you dug beneath many of your floors, you'd find immediately large ash-filled pits filled with artifacts, ground stone right at the top from the 1700s. You know, a wealth of information that has not seen a drop of rain for many, many hundreds of years, which is great. I won't go through the hundreds of corn cobs that we got out of here. I need someone to study these corn cobs, but they're tiny. It's really remarkable. This is the old Pueblo style of corn that they were growing here in the 1700s. So that's an ear of corn is less than 2 inches. You know, this is and they were all that way. This is, you know, for comparison, this is a 20th century ear of corn, that probably 20th century. It was also underneath some of our floorboards, but you can see by comparison the difference. They were growing much different varieties of corn in those early days. But you might also excavate in another room, which had been, you know, not terribly interesting to you when you had been just living there and walking over it all the time. You can see Ellen investigating the pit that we've just begun to excavate. And I wish I could share with you more of these objects. A couple of them are over there for you to see after the talk. But you find things like a Victorian coin purse underneath the floorboards. Right down there, again, beneath your feet all the time. But my favorite objects from this room were 9 spoons that were below the floorboards. And in wondering why there were spoons in this room, I spoke with Richard Mermejo, the late Richard Mermejo, who we all miss very much, from Pickery's Pueblo. I said, you know, what's the deal with these spoons? Do you have any ideas? He said, oh yeah, that's an old Hispano thing. When a child is born, you bury a spoon underneath the floor. And Tommy has heard these stories as well, and we're going to sit down and record those stories. would you like to actually just interject and offer what you were telling me just before the break?
Well, the spoons were, for what I read there, they were for good luck for the baby, for sustenance, for good luck. And maybe then spoons were for the 9 kids, maybe that how they were born, you know, but it meant good luck and good sustenance.
Yeah. So all these spoons are from the early 20th century. There was like, within that one generation, 9 kids born in this room, let's just say, which I find very moving, to recognize. Okay, so we can look at architecture, we can look at artifacts, but the final material that I want to share with you are the artifacts that don't come from inside rooms, inside toriums, or inside below the floors that we live in today, but out there on the exterior spaces where folks dumped trash. Archaeologists are, in love with refuse. We love it when people, we hate it when trash collection comes to a community and they take all of the household refuse and put it in one big mixed up dump. It's terrible for us methodologically. We love it when they dig a pit and put the trash in and cap it over, and then we know when it dates to. That's what we found on the plaza. So I want to share with you our excavations from this summer. Let's see here. Here are the excavations midway through. We're digging down just behind Winston's house, if you know where Winston lives on the plaza. It's on the south side of the plaza. It's not really, it's on the edge of the plaza today. It would have been a little more centrally located in the 1800s. That stone wall there is more recent. But what you can see is we're going through a variety of deposits, which have remarkable materials in them. And this is, let me just go back real quickly. This face here of the excavations now looks like this. So this is, my students will help remind me, but maybe 6 meters wide, something like that. And it's an archive of 300 years of life out there on that landscape. In fact, there's some pre-colonial pits underneath this too that go back to the indigenous days that we've yet to fully excavate. Nevertheless, you're looking at strata, ash, from many, many years that has been dumped out there, along with the artifacts that were thrown away. And in the bottom panel, I've outlined the different, strata that we've identified by looking at this profile of our excavations. And I kind of just want to walk you through it now. You can come and see this tomorrow. We invite you to come and take a gander. All of this is built on what we're calling stratum 1, the geological substrate. It's pretty loose sand. It's one big sandbar that the old plaza is built on. Our first substantial colonial era deposit, stratum 2, however, was a very large trash-filled pit. It's like 6 feet by 6 feet. It's a huge excavation that dates sometime in the late 1700s. They dumped a lot of trash in there, and that trash, we haven't been able to date precisely yet, but certainly it predates the Santa Fe Trail, and it's consistent with what we know ceramically from other parts of our excavations as dating to the late 1700s, after Embudo was reoccupied in 1750. We find things like what we call Pahohi polychrome, a Tewa Basin pottery ware. We find Hickory Apache micaceous pottery over there on the right. All of the pottery here is indigenous. There's not a stitch of anything that I can say was made locally. That's really been hard to identify. A couple of other examples. This was pottery that by this point in the late 18th century was probably being produced for consumption in Spanish households. The imagery still retains some icons that are significant for indigenous folks. These feathers would have had a special kind of meaning. But increasingly they were abstract geometrics, something that would be pleasing to Spanish consumers, but not overly sensitive. You also find a lot of red on buff pottery. Some of you probably found this in the garden. This was actually a soup bowl that had a big wide rim that you put your tortillas on. This was specifically made for Spanish consumers by Tewa folks. We also find a great deal of animal bone in this early deposit. Sheep, goat, cow, very little pigs yet, no chicken. There was no evidence that they were actually keeping chickens during the 18th century, as we haven't found it yet. So a lot of the remains of their cuisine, as well as on the right or left there, one of a number of monos that were from here. This was a time when they were still doing all of their grinding with stone tools. And I'm going to pass this around. This is the grinding stone that is in this image. And I just want you to feel as it passes around how heavy it is. This is the kind of thing that in Pueblo households, women would spend 8 hours a day grinding with. I think that was true in Hispano households from the 18th century as well. It shaped women's bodies. The Embudo women of the 18th century would have had very wide shoulders and massively powerful forearms. So as it passes around, just feel the heft of that. Imagine spending hours a day on the grindstone with that. So a big pit was the first thing that was made. A secondary pit was dug into that, dating to right about the same time period, maybe a little bit later. But as we look to our major pit here, what we're calling Stratum 4, this was a large pit that jumps ahead to around 1900. There's no Santa Fe Trail signature that we found on the plaza yet. This was a pretty cool pit. We're now in the post-railroad period, so it's around 1900. The railroad, comes in, and by the 1890s, metals are no longer really scarce. There's no metals in the early deposits. Glass is coming in large amounts. We find things like shoes that are now being increasingly, brought in by Montgomery Ward catalogs via the railroad, or spoons that are being deposited in the trash. These are also from that pit. So, an archive to compare with our early sample from the 1700s, the kind of thing that just makes us rejoice. What else do we find? Well, if we go one step further to deposit 5, which dates to the early 1900s, horseshoes. And we find not only the horseshoes on the plaza, animal bones around it, but we find horseshoe impressions. This was a time period, of course, in the early 20th century when horses would have been a very common scene on the plaza. They left their mark, not just with their shoes, but with their imprints. We also find some remarkable finds. This was from our 2015 excavations in that same unit of a post-1902 Army seal button that came out of that same pit. As well as, Sophia, I'm looking to you again, your prize find from this summer, this wonderful metal peacock, where's Aaron? You figured out what its source was. Would you like to stand up and say what it is?
This was a Cracker Jack prize from the 1920s.
She just found that out today. I was like, great, we'll put that in the show. Yeah, so from the 1920s, this is the time period indeed that we're situated in here. Marbles were popular. They were the old clay marbles, so back then still. So a lot of evidence of kids' life on the plaza. There are some other remarkable objects like this roach fragment that probably also dates to right around the 20s or 30s, something like that. That some poor woman with broad shoulders, unfortunately, dropped on the plaza. So, sheet-ridden trash that's just sort of washing over the plaza and getting deposited, dating to the early 1900s. There's a little bit more from the mid-1900s, from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that's right above it. This was a remarkable archive in many respects. I'm only going to point to a couple of objects that were recovered from this. One of our only, I think this might be our earliest penny that we've excavated from 1937. It's kind of late, right? They didn't have much coin out here. How much have we made? 76 cents or something? We always think we got 76 cents out of all of this digging. But it's probably from the 40s or so that it was deposited there. But what you're looking at on the left are bullet casings, shotgun casings, and that sort of thing. That also were only found in that layer. And there's a very famous story in town that, Tommy, I'm looking to you again. Could I turn it to you, the great feud on the Dixon Plaza?
There was a prohibition between the Novatos and the Medinas, and when it was right after the March of the Novios and the Club Tropicana, they killed the father and 2 sons on the Medinas in 1929. No, this was a big wedding in January 1929, and my grandpa went my grandpa came around the corner and there was a man that just witnessed a shooting, and he was so nervous his cigarette was just bouncing like that. No, he was just scared, you know. But that would be during the prohibition years.
Yeah. That's right about the time of the.
We knew somebody with bullets.
I know, yeah. No, it's hard not to speculate, but this is part of that story, so, yeah. Anyway, so the life on the plaza during the sort of, first half of the 20th century represented there in those bullet casings. Thank you, Tom. So, the last thing put down on the plaza from the 70s when the old dance hall became the firehouse and they laid down gravels. And so, a kind of history via the archaeology. We're going to be studying these artifacts at great length in the coming year back on campus at Barnard. We've already, however, studied the artifacts from one other area, and this is the last area that I want to share with you. This was excavations we conducted not on the old plaza, but just to the north of it. This is an area that would have been outside of the plaza, outside of Juan Francisco Martin's 18th century hacienda here that he inherited from his father. This is a midden, a trash dump, but an exceptionally deep trash dump. In fact, the deepest trash dump that I know of from the Spanish colonial period. Right there that Marcia drives over, that I drive over, that Chris and Mariana drive over every day. This is what it looks like, back in 2019, I think it was, when these excavations were happening. You can see all that dark sediment in the foreground. That's early 1800s artifacts that are coming out of there that are just eroding away. And so, we've been testing this old midden, and we've done many years of excavation there and study of the artifacts. I'm just going to quickly share with you a few of those finds. They were deep pits, right? This was our deepest. This was the one that, if you are familiar with the display case in the bottom, had a double wolf burial, 9 feet down below the surface there. But more interesting to me right now is all those layers of trash, that were deposited in this deep trash dump at the edge of the old village. So you can see this straight here. This is just generations of mothers telling their sons to clear out the hearth and go dump it out there because it's getting dirty. And if you're an archaeologist who digs these things really carefully, what you end up producing are stratigraphic profiles. This is our stratigraphic profile of excavation units we dug in 2016, 17, and 19. It took us that many years to figure out what was going on with this. It's a very complicated stratigraphic profile. We did various sampling of microbotanical remains in here that Emmy Dawson, a former graduate student of mine, did some amazing work on for her dissertation. But just in quick summary form, what we landed upon when we dug up this midden was, and the reason why it was so deep is because I think at the very bottom was an early acequia that actually Tommy and I were trying to figure out exactly how it ran. But what you can see is the spill pile from cleaning it out. I think it would have served the plaza when they were making adobe bricks, maybe back as early as 1725. That might have been, they always say acequias are the first thing you do when you start a new community. Making adobe bricks might have been the second thing. So this water might have supplied the plaza with water as they started constructing the initial structures. I think it probably dates to between 1725 and 1747 when the village was abandoned because it was just too precarious out there. The majority of the artifacts come from this very dense deposit of refuse that's just a little bit further up in the middle of the section here. This has dense refuse that I would date based on the ceramics and everything, and some radiocarbon dates to between 1750 and 1875. It predates the railroad. We don't have any railroad deposits in this profile. And that kind of leaves us with the question of what was in between. This is clean sand. We thought we were at the end of our excavations when we hit it, but then realized with a little bit of coring, we need to go further down. This is one of those big rain events, I think, that dumped a whole lot of sand that filled in the acequia even further, probably while they weren't living here during those 3 years or so, between 1747 and 1750. Really nicely separates the deposits. Anyway, this is the kind of material that came out of the midden. It's kind of wonderful artifacts. Some of the very earliest in the center bottom, Tewa polychrome. This is a type of pottery that was made primarily in the 17th century and into the early 18th century. It's the type of pottery that folks at Wingate, at Santa Clara, at other Tewa Pueblos made for themselves with ritually powerful designs on it. What you're looking at on the right-hand side is that, what that evolved into what we call ogapogi or pahogi polychrome, with designs that are more influenced by Spanish aesthetics. Other things, you'll find crucifixes, those came out of the midden, speaking to the faith of the community here. Metal arrow points, we had a number of those come out, a gun flint right here. And then what was probably the dominant way of hunting and of fighting was chipstone arrowheads. I think there was a brisk trade of Pueblo folks making arrowheads for consumption in Spanish households. So, this is what we are going to be undertaking with the new excavations, but I just share what we've done from those old midden excavations outside of the plaza. We'll be constructing these kinds of diagrams of the change in material culture through time. This, if you looked at that stratigraphic profile and placed this right over top of it, you'd be able to see the story of, an early period when bone was washing into the old acequia, with chip stone also washing in and coming into popularity here. They were using stone tools rather than metal. They didn't have much metal. You'd see the real deposit refuse beginning after that swale fill, during the period of abandonment. Ceramics and bone being dumped there now purposefully. You'd find after that midden deposit the modern fill, where glass and metal, all the stuff post-railroad, starts showing up. And then you'd get really serious about it. You'd get like loads of students who are susceptible to this kind of thing. And you'd tell them to count all of these and weigh all of them and typologize all of them. And you'd ask them to do that. I think our ceramic database now has 80,000 shirts in it from these middens, and we're only a tiny of the way through all of the material that we've excavated. We have hundreds of thousands of shirts to deal with. And you'd start to produce changes in different pottery types through time. I'm not going to go through the details here, but what you're looking at is sort of styles as they've changed, with different pottery types becoming popular, others waning in popularity. And off on the right-hand side there, I put some of the very few trade wares, stuff that was coming in. Here, we have represented the Santa Fe Trail, some of these glazewares that arose. The big message here, and now I'm moving towards the conclusion, is that it's almost all native pottery. It's mostly made in the Tewa Basin. There is micaceous pottery that I think is primarily hickory. There's probably, I need to get Braylon to help me with this actually, there's probably some hickory's pottery in there as well, but there's a lot of it that's diagnostically hickory. There's a little bit of what archaeologists have speculated might have been local production. This gray utility ware. I'm not convinced that it was made locally. The pastes don't look like they're from the Tewa Basin as well. Again, I pose that question. What was the economic life of folks here? What was their relations with their neighbors that led them to be eating consistently, uniquely off of indigenous pottery? What can this tell us about the broader economic question? Certainly we know that these were folks who weren't getting much along the Santa Fe Trail, with tiny numbers of imports from the late 18th and early 19th century. These kinds of things, they're very, very rare. We have like 4 pieces of Maiolica pottery from Mexico City, and a few things coming in on the Santa Fe Trail from England. Again, it's the indigenous pottery that interests me. Indigenous pottery alongside settler animal bones, the remains of food consumption practices. Although they were eating in bowls that came from Pueblo folks, they weren't eating like Pueblo folks. Pretty much everything they ate was from domesticated animals, very little hunting. So where's Aaron again? There you are. This is a throwback picture from a few years ago when we were still at Barnard. You convince some other students who are susceptible to this sort of thing to take tens of thousands of animal bones, and you start to actually construct a picture of how food waste changed through time. Certainly to the assemblage in which sheep, cow, and goat dominated. Pig, although we know it was present throughout the record, really only becomes a significant part of the food waste in the 20th century, I think. There was very, very little elk and deer. That has been very surprising to us. These weren't hunters at all. They didn't trade for hunted meat either. And almost no chicken or turkey until very, very late in the sequence, till the 20th century. Nor rabbit or dog, with the exception of a few little isolated pieces. This is actually a bone bead made out of a dog femur that we found there. There's a story, I'm sure. Okay, so this is the archaeological archive that we can compare with the textual archive. And we can look back and return to something like one Francisco Martin's will from 1767. He outlines, along with his properties that he owned, all of the animals that he possessed: horses, mules, mares, colts, sheep, goats, cattle, oxen, pigs. Clearly, the herds were dominated by sheep, and this is the kind of closing point that I want to make. We found a ton of sheep bone, and it again brings me back to this question of economic relations. Sheep were a kind of fungible wealth within Spanish colonial society. You paid the church in sheep rather than in coin. You helped your neighbors out by giving them sheep rather than money to go buy what they needed. It was also a kind of investable wealth by the partido system, where you would give your flocks to someone else to herd for you. They would get some of the offspring of that flock, and you would get all of the rest of it. You didn't have to take care of your flocks. It was a way of building up your estate. They were also one of the very few exports that were sent out of this community and many others. Initially to northern Mexico during Spanish colonial times, to all those mines that needed to be supplied with meat, silver mines, then to California during the gold rush, and ultimately to American soldiers during the Civil War. One of the few things you could make a few bits of money off of. Okay, so I'm rushing to the close because I know it's getting late and there's some artifacts for you to look at. But I want to return to that question mark around vicinal economics, and I just want to offer just a few final comments here. Archaeologists, by and large, have looked at all of that material record that I've just shared with you, all of that bone, all of that chipstone, all of that pottery, and they've looked at it as a kind of predecessor to capitalism, to the monetary systems that swept in here during the 20th century. They refer to it as a barter economy. I have some shoes, you have some corn, let's trade. Which is a very inconvenient way of really supplying yourself with the things you need. But if the person doesn't need the shoes that you wear on your feet, he already has some. So there is a way in which everything that characterizes relations during Spanish colonial times has been regarded as an impoverished form of capitalism. Would that they had money. Would that they could have had markets. Wasn't it great that the Americans came in and gave them wage labor? This is the narrative. I don't think it was like that at all. I think that if we go back to the actual material record, as well as the archival references to the indigenous background for many of the folks who lived here, they were not working in a capitalist society that had fallen apart on the northern frontier and reverted to a kind of barter relationship. These were folks who had indigenous backgrounds, and they were surrounded by indigenous folks who had their own economic systems. What David Graeber, the late David Graeber, who started the Occupy movement and is one of the few card-carrying anarchist anthropologists, what he wrote in his wonderful book, Debt, what he referred to as everyday communism. This was built on the principle from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. A principle of being perpetually indebted to one another because you have kinship relations, because you're members of the church together, because you've built up a kind of fictive kinship through your years of trading. Not a transactional barter system, but rather an economic world built on that kind of sociality of everyday communism. And this is the point that I want to end with. That fell apart only in the 1950s out here. There are probably still members of our community who remember what it meant to live in a non-capitalist society without wage labor. And if we think towards the next 300 years of this community's existence, it very well may be that this everyday communism, which is so long ago, might have a new life. And so I look forward to the archaeologists of the future who are going to be digging up what we leave behind today, and to see if this prediction, I'll leave it as a prediction, is borne out. I'm going to end it there with just one final statement. visit our excavations. We're also planning to put a time capsule in those excavations for the archaeologists of the future to dig up 300 years from now. So I'm talking with various community members. If you'd like to be involved with that, seek us out. We'd love to have your participation. Thank you for your attention.
I can't imagine a more fitting presentation to recognize the 300th anniversary of the Embudo land grant.